A man walks down a crowded New York sidewalk in 1912, his head completely bare. Passers-by turn their heads in disgust, whispering about his clear lack of sanity. The New York Times prints a headline, labeling his exposed scalp a sign of mental instability. This was not a fashion choice. It was a violation of the public social order. For over a century, a man without a hat was a man without a reputation. But to understand why a simple piece of felt held such lethal social weight, you have to look back to the rigid standards of the Victorian era. In 1859, the publication The Habits of Good Society codified the rules of the gentleman. It declared that any man appearing in public without a hat was fundamentally undressed. This was not merely a suggestion of style, it was an absolute mandate for public decency. The hat functioned as a primary visual indicator of a man's moral character. It signaled his occupation, his class, and his adherence to the laws of civil society. In the sprawling urban centers of London and New York, the hat was a requirement for entry. To walk through the door of a theater or a bank bareheaded was to invite immediate suspicion. The architecture of the cities themselves reinforced this necessity. Public buildings were designed with dedicated hat check rooms near every entrance. Etiquette forbade the wearing of headwear inside, yet the hat remained a permanent extension of the person. It was a mandatory accessory that governed every interaction from the morning commute to the evening meal. The standard of dress was enforced by more than just social pressure. Professional firms in major cities strictly required employees to wear hats during their daily transit. A bare head suggested poverty or a dangerous desire to reject the status quo. The hat was the shield that protected a man's status in a world that scrutinized his every appearance. This obsession with headwear created a massive, lucrative industry. In 1850, London hatters William Bowler and Thomas Bowler engineered a new design for the firm Lock & Company. They created a durable, hard felt hat intended to withstand the rigors of the working class. What began as a practical tool for gamekeepers quickly evolved into the standard uniform of the middle class. By the 1880s, the bowler hat represented the height of urban respectability. This rigid uniformity held steady for decades. It was an era where the hat defined the man, and the man dared not step outside without it. Yet, beneath the surface of this mandatory tradition, a quiet shift was already beginning to take hold. The infrastructure of the city was changing, and the hat was about to lose its grip on the public. The year was 1859. A small leather-bound volume titled The Habits of Good Society appeared on bookstore shelves across London. It was more than a book of manners. It was a rigid blueprint for public survival. The text declared that a man appearing in public without a hat was fundamentally undressed. It defined the hat as the primary boundary between a gentleman and a vagrant. The manual established a clear hierarchy of decorum. A man's character was judged by the quality of his felt and the precision of his brim. In London and New York, the hat acted as a visual shorthand for social standing. A bowler hat signaled a working man of reliable character. A tall, silk topper identified a man of wealth and professional influence. The street was an open courtroom. A passerby could discern a man's occupation simply by the silhouette on his head. The hat was never merely a garment. It was a badge of moral citizenship. But to understand why this code held such power, you have to look at how it governed the physical movement of people. In the bustling financial districts of Manhattan, the hat was a mandatory tool of the trade. A clerk without a hat was an anomaly that drew stares of genuine hostility. The New York Times captured this tension with clinical precision. The paper tracked the rise of the hatless movement among youth and university students. The public viewed these bareheaded men as victims of a profound mental instability. Society demanded a uniform. Men complied because the cost of non-compliance was total social exclusion. The hat established a common language of respect in a crowded, anonymous city. It signaled that a man understood his place in the social order. Every interaction on the sidewalk was mediated by the tipping of a brim. It was a silent, practiced ritual of acknowledgement. When a man raised his hat to a superior, he was confirming his own adherence to the law. The hat was the physical anchor of the Victorian ego. It remained on the head until the moment a man crossed a threshold into private space. The architecture of the era mirrored this obsession. Entryways were designed with specific zones for the removal and storage of headwear. A bank lobby in 1860 was incomplete without a dedicated hat room. To keep a hat on while indoors was an act of aggressive defiance. The hat provided a constant, heavy reminder of one's duty to the public eye. It was a burden that every man carried from his morning departure until his evening return. For decades, this standard remained unyielding. The hat was the shield that protected a man's reputation from the scrutiny of the city. The year was 1850 in London. The firm of Lock & Company sought a new design. They needed a hat that could survive the English countryside. Two brothers stepped forward to solve the problem. William Bowler and Thomas Bowler accepted the commission. They were expert hatters with a reputation for precision. Their goal was a durable, hard felt hat for the working class. They envisioned a piece of headwear that resisted thorns and branches. It was initially intended for gamekeepers. These men required protection while patrolling dense forests on horseback. The design featured a low, rounded crown and a narrow brim. It was crafted from layers of felt hardened with shellac. The result was a hat that felt like a helmet. It sat tight against the head to prevent it from blowing away. The brothers presented the prototype to Lock & Company. It was an immediate departure from the tall, fragile silk toppers. The hat was functional, sturdy, and remarkably cheap to produce. But to understand why this moment mattered, you need to see the shift in urban fashion. The bowler hat did not stay in the woods for long. By the 1880s, the design had migrated to the city streets. It became the standard uniform of the middle class. Bankers, clerks, and businessmen adopted the hard felt shell. The bowler offered a sense of security in a crowded metropolis. It was a hat that could be crushed in a train car and still retain its shape. It signaled a man of reliable character and industrious habits. The silhouette became synonymous with the British professional. It was the physical manifestation of Victorian efficiency. The hat was no longer just for gamekeepers. It was the mandatory armor of the modern urban worker. Thousands of these hats moved through the streets of London every morning. They created a sea of uniform, dark felt across the financial district. The bowler had successfully bridged the gap between labor and management. It was the most successful hat design in the history of the industry. The brothers had inadvertently created a global symbol of respectability. Every man wearing one was participating in a silent, shared code. They were all part of the same structured, orderly society. The hat was built to last, and for a time it seemed it would. The 1920s brought a fundamental shift in the silhouette of the urban man. The hard, rigid shell of the bowler hat began to feel archaic. Men sought a softer, more fluid aesthetic to match the changing pace of life. The fedora and the trilby emerged as the new standard of masculine style. These hats featured a pinched crown and a flexible snap-down brim. They offered a sense of casual elegance that the bowler could not replicate. The transition was not driven by the working class, but by the highest levels of the British monarchy. In 1924, the Prince of Wales, later known as Edward VIII, stepped into the public eye. He wore a Homburg hat on an official visit, turning the piece into an instant sensation. The public watched the Prince of Wales closely for every shift in sartorial direction. When he adopted the fedora, the mass market followed his lead within weeks. Photographs of the Prince of Wales in his signature headwear appeared in newspapers across the globe. The fedora became the dominant headwear for millions of men in London and New York. It signaled a move toward a more relaxed, individualistic form of public presentation. But to understand why this shift mattered, you need to see the power of royal influence over the common wardrobe. The fedora was not just a fashion choice, it was a deliberate departure from the stiff uniformity of the Victorian era. Retailers in London rushed to stock the new styles to meet the sudden, frantic demand. The fedora allowed for more expressive movement than the structured bowler. The crown could be creased in different ways to suit the wearer's personal preference. It represented a subtle rebellion against the rigid, standardized codes of the previous century. Edward VIII made the transition to casual headwear seem like a mark of modern sophistication. Men across the Western world discarded their bowlers in favor of the felt fedora. The hat industry saw record sales as the new trend swept through every major city. The fedora became the unofficial uniform of the interwar period. It was the headwear of choice for the rising middle class of the 1920s. Journalists and businessmen adopted the style to project a sense of modern, approachable authority. The hat still served as a badge of respectability, but the rules had softened. The fedora was acceptable in both the boardroom and the less formal social settings of the era. It bridged the gap between the formal past and the increasingly casual future. By the end of the 1920s, the fedora had cemented its place as the definitive hat of the century. The Prince of Wales had effectively rewritten the rules of public dress. His influence proved that the hat was still a central pillar of masculine identity. Even as the styles changed, the expectation that a man would wear a hat remained absolute. The fedora was the final evolution of the mandatory public uniform before the decline began. It was the peak of the hat-wearing era before the rise of the automobile and the post-war shift. The transition from the bowler to the fedora showed how quickly a society could abandon its old standards. But the social pressure to cover the head remained as heavy as ever. The fedora was a lighter hat, but it carried the same weight of social obligation. A man still risked social exclusion if he appeared in public without his hat. The fedora was the last great triumph of the hat manufacturing industry. It set the stage for the final, desperate marketing campaigns of the 1930s. The world was changing, but the hat stayed firmly on the head of every man in the street. Blueprints from the 1920s reveal a strange architectural necessity. Architects in New York and Chicago carved out dedicated space for hats. These were the hat check rooms. They were mandatory features in the designs of theaters and restaurants. Social etiquette strictly forbade men from wearing hats indoors. A man entering a dining room remained undressed until he removed his headwear. The hat check room solved this social dilemma. An attendant stood behind a counter to receive the felt burden. The attendant hung the hat on a numbered brass hook. The owner received a small metal tag in exchange. The system allowed the elite to navigate public spaces without offending others. Expensive restaurants in Manhattan featured elaborate cloakrooms near the entrance. These rooms were placed to ensure the hat never touched a dining surface. Table manners demanded that the head remain bare during a meal. A hat left on a table signaled a lack of breeding. The hat check room became a pillar of urban infrastructure. Blueprints for the grand hotels of the era prioritized this space. The room was often finished in marble or dark wood. It projected an image of order and high-status service. The hat check attendant became a staple of the city landscape. Customers tipped these workers to ensure their property remained safe. The industry supported thousands of employees in major metropolitan centers. This service was not a luxury for the wealthy alone. It was a standard expectation for any respectable public establishment. The practice reinforced the social obligation of the hat. The hat was not merely a garment to be worn. It was an object that required constant management. The hat check room acknowledged this burden as a shared reality. It transformed the individual act of removing a hat into a ritual. Architects designed the flow of traffic around these small, enclosed spaces. They knew that the hat was the first thing a man removed. The hat check room was a physical manifestation of Victorian decorum. It remained a central feature of public life for decades. But the blueprints began to change as the century moved forward. The necessity of the hat check room eventually faded away. The architectural legacy of these spaces persists in old buildings today. They stand as reminders of a time when the hat was absolute. The hat was a weight that every man carried through the day. The city itself was built to accommodate the requirements of the felt crown. Every theater door and office lobby was designed with the hat in mind. The era of the hat check was the era of the mandatory public uniform. The year was 1930. The American hat industry faced a quiet, creeping catastrophe. Men were leaving their hats at home with increasing frequency. The rise of the automobile made the traditional headwear a physical burden. Car roofs were low and cramped for a man wearing a felt crown. Manufacturers watched their profit margins wither as the public grew indifferent. The industry responded with a massive, coordinated counteroffensive. They formed the Hat Research Foundation to save their dying trade. This was a trade group of the largest hat manufacturers in America. They pooled their capital to launch an aggressive national marketing campaign. Their goal was to restore the hat to its position of absolute necessity. Billboards appeared in every major city from New York to Chicago. Full-page advertisements filled the back covers of popular magazines. The copywriters focused on the social cost of going bareheaded. They crafted a slogan that became a staple of the era. If you want to get ahead, get a hat. The phrase appeared on posters in subways and train stations. It was a direct appeal to the ambitions of the rising middle class. The foundation argued that a hat was the primary marker of success. They claimed that a man without a hat was a man without prospects. The campaign targeted the insecurity of the post-Depression worker. It suggested that professional advancement required the proper uniform. Department stores dedicated entire floors to the latest felt styles. Sales associates were trained to emphasize the hat as a career tool. They treated the purchase of a fedora as a vital business investment. The foundation monitored sales data across the United States. They published reports on the declining influence of the bareheaded man. The rhetoric grew increasingly desperate as the 1940s approached. Advertisements warned that a man in public without a hat was incomplete. They linked the lack of a hat to a lack of self-respect. The campaign flooded the airwaves with radio jingles and testimonials. It was the first time an entire industry attempted to legislate fashion. The foundation fought against the encroaching reality of the modern world. They tried to convince a generation that their comfort was a mistake. But the trend of hatless living continued to accelerate regardless. The marketing campaign was a sophisticated response to a cultural shift. It was the final expensive effort to maintain an outdated social code. The foundation spent millions to defend the tradition of the hat. The reality was that the culture had already begun to move on. The campaign proved that even the best marketing could not stop time. The hat remained a requirement, but the requirement was losing its power. The design of the American automobile shifted rapidly during the late 1940s. Engineers lowered the rooflines of new sedan models to improve aerodynamics and handling. A man sitting behind the steering wheel found his hat hitting the ceiling. The felt crown of a standard fedora was no longer compatible with the modern interior. The driver had to choose between his headwear and his comfort. Most men opted for the convenience of the open cabin. They removed their hats before climbing into the driver's seat. The act of going bareheaded became a physical necessity rather than a fashion statement. Industry leaders at the Hat Corporation of America watched the trend with mounting alarm. Their internal sales data showed a consistent decline in volume starting in 1948. The market for formal headwear struggled to survive the transition to the suburban commute. Automobile manufacturers prioritized low-profile frames that left no room for a tall hat. The hat had been a stationary object in a world of walking and public transit. It was not designed for the confined space of a moving vehicle. The hat box, once a staple of the home, became an empty relic in the closet. Drivers left their headwear on the passenger seat or the rear parcel shelf. The sun and heat began to warp the delicate felt of the abandoned hats. Many men stopped carrying them entirely to avoid the risk of damage. The social requirement of the hat crumbled under the weight of automotive progress. The car had effectively rendered the century-old etiquette of the hat obsolete. But to understand why that moment mattered, you need to see how rapidly the status symbol lost its value. The shift was not just about the roof of a car. It was about the fundamental change in how a man occupied space. The hat had once defined his silhouette in a crowded city street. Inside a car, that silhouette was hidden from the eyes of the public. The need to signal one's status through a hat disappeared the moment the door closed. The automobile provided a private, mobile sanctuary where social rules did not apply. Men found they could go to work without the rigid pressure of the felt crown. The industry tried to pivot by promoting smaller, more compact styles. They marketed hats that were supposedly designed for the modern motorist. But the appeal of the bare head was already too strong to reverse. The economy of the hat was losing its primary structural support. The car had won, and the hat was left behind in the garage. The global conflict ended in 1945. Millions of soldiers returned to the United States. They arrived home in standardized military uniforms. These men had lived in rigid, regulated environments for years. The military life left no room for individual expression. Every aspect of their appearance had been dictated by command. The hat was a mandatory part of that uniform. It was a symbol of their service and their submission to order. Civilian life offered a different set of possibilities. The veterans sought comfort and personal freedom above all else. They rejected the stiff, formal clothing of their fathers. The market shifted to reflect this new desire for ease. Men began wearing loose trousers and softer shirts. The heavy, structured felt hat felt like a relic of the barracks. Discarding the hat became a quiet act of rebellion. It was a rejection of the strict social hierarchy of the pre-war era. Industry analysts observed the change with growing concern. The Hat Corporation of America recorded a steep drop in demand. The uniform of the respectable man was rapidly unraveling. Retailers stocked fewer styles to accommodate the shrinking customer base. The formal etiquette of the city office began to fray. Younger workers prioritized comfort over the traditions of the past. The hat was no longer a requirement for professional success. It was an optional accessory that many chose to leave behind. The cultural shift was deep and irreversible. Individualism replaced the rigid uniformity of the early century. The era of the mandatory public hat reached its natural conclusion. The social pressure to remain covered in public evaporated. The industry tried to adapt to the new, casual reality. They marketed lighter, more flexible styles for the modern man. The attempts to reclaim the market failed to gain traction. The hat had lost its place in the American identity. The transition occurred in every major urban center. New York and Chicago saw the streets transform within a decade. The hat check room became a ghost of the past. The architecture of the city remained, but the habits changed. The once essential accessory vanished from the public eye. The era of the hat ended not with a single event. It dissolved under the weight of a changing society. A popular myth persists in the pages of history books. It claims that John F. Kennedy single-handedly destroyed the American hat industry. The story points to his 1961 inauguration ceremony. Observers noted the president-elect stood bareheaded before the gathered crowd. Many historians suggest this one moment signaled the end of formal male headwear. The reality was far more mundane and much older than a single political event. Data from the Hat Corporation of America tells a different story. Internal sales records showed a steady, sharp decline in volume as early as 1948. The market for formal headwear had been hemorrhaging customers for over a decade. By the time John F. Kennedy took the oath of office, the industry was already in ruins. The decline was fueled by a convergence of architectural and social shifts. Automobile manufacturers had lowered vehicle rooflines to improve aerodynamics. The standard Fedora crown no longer cleared the ceiling of a modern sedan. Drivers were forced to choose between their comfort and their status. Most men prioritized the ease of travel over the strict etiquette of the past. The Hat Research Foundation had attempted to intervene during the 1930s. Their aggressive marketing campaign used the slogan, "If you want to get ahead, get a hat." They spent significant capital trying to arrest the cultural shift toward casual dress. The campaign failed to reverse the downward trend of the post-war years. Returning veterans sought a break from the rigid uniformity of their military service. They abandoned the structured heavy felt hats that defined their father's generation. The formal urban commute, which once demanded a hat, was slowly disappearing. Suburban living patterns favored the convenience of the private car over the public train. The hat check room, once a mandatory feature of every major hotel and theater, stood empty. Architects stopped including these spaces in new building blueprints by the late 1950s. The social requirement for a hat had effectively evaporated long before the 1961 inauguration. John F. Kennedy merely reflected the reality that had already taken hold in American life. He was a symbol of a new post-war era that rejected the formality of the Victorian age. The hat industry had been dying since the late 1940s due to the design of the car. The myth of the inaugural hatless moment ignores the slow decay of a century-old tradition. The transition was not a sudden collapse at a podium. It was the quiet, inevitable result of a society that had outgrown its own dress code. The mid-century architectural shift finalized the erasure of the hat. The sprawling suburbs of the 1950s prioritized the private garage over the public transit hub. Men no longer stepped from their homes into the collective scrutiny of the city street. The commute changed from a social performance into a private, isolated act within a sedan. The rigid etiquette manuals of the 1850s became relics of a defunct social order. The demand for hat check rooms in new building blueprints vanished entirely by 1960. The physical architecture of the modern office reflected this newfound casual culture. Employers stopped enforcing the dress codes that had defined the professional class for a century. The hat, once an essential signal of moral character, became an optional, cumbersome artifact. The industry that once dominated the fashion world collapsed under the weight of its own obsolescence. The Hat Corporation of America shuttered its factories as the public lost interest in the felt crown. The transition was not a sudden accident of history, but a quiet, structural surrender. Society had simply outgrown the need to signal status through the covering of the head. The hatless man, once viewed by the public as a sign of mental instability, became the new norm. You look at your own reflection and see a world that has discarded its uniform. You walk through streets where nobody expects you to signal your status with a crown. The rituals you think are permanent are just waiting for the next shift in the wind. You are already living in the aftermath of a tradition you forgot to mourn.